What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like it in Magic. In case you hadn't heard, Wizards is doing a standard Pauper event for free over on Magic Arena, and it's kind of all the rage right now. So today, I figured I'd bring you 5 awesome, unique standard Pauper decks you probably haven't seen yet. We got a lot to talk about, so I want to go ahead and jump in, but before we get to it, just remember, like the video, subscribe if you haven't done it yet, and if you're interested in any of these decks for paper, because some of them make really good F&M decks, just click any of the links in the description. They'll take you over to a TCG player where you can grab these decks for super cheap. But now that all that's out of the way, let's go ahead and get to it with the first deck, White-Black Life Gain. Now, we don't have a whole lot in Standard right now at the common level that triggers off of Life Gain, but we do have at least one good card, and that's Epicure of Blood. It's a big enough creature in its own right to do some damage by itself, but it also converts Life Gain into damage, which is really, really valuable, and actually Epicure is the only non-land card in the deck that doesn't somehow gain us life. Every single other card synergizes with Epicure of Blood, in that every single other card in the deck is capable of gaining us life in some way or another, and good news, most of those cards are creatures. We get to play a bunch of bodies on board that are also capable of gaining life and triggering Epicure. And we get to get on board pretty early too, you know, we get to play 4 Healer's Hawk and 300 Witness in the deck. Both of these are really early drops that let us have some kind of board presence in the really early game to counter all these aggro decks we're seeing in Standard Pauper right now. And they can help gain us life too. Healer's Hawk is actually a pretty decent attacker some of the time. And Hunted Witness is really good in Standard right now. It's good against sweepers like Clarion, and it's good against stuff like Goblin Chainwhirler. We may not have those concerns in Standard Pauper, but it's still a great card. And after it inevitably dies in combat, we get a lifelink guy, which helps out with Epicure. In the 2-drop slot, we get Bishop Soldier and Daybreak Chaplain. And Bishop Soldier might look like its initials at first glance, but it's actually a pretty solid attacker in this format specifically. And if it trades on blocks, not only will you be able to take out one of their creatures, but you gain a couple of life too, which always seems fine. And Daybreak Chaplain, you know, Charlie Chaplain is not a great attacker, but at the same time, he's a much better blocker than Bishop Soldier, and he's great against the swamp of aggro decks that we're facing right now. In the 3-drop slot, there's Queen's Commission. This card doesn't look like much either, but it's actually a really important card in Standard Pauper in a couple of decks. There's a green-white tokens deck that likes to play this. But in this deck, it is 2 different life gain triggers, which is pretty sweet. It's 2 creatures on the board, which is great when it comes to blocking or even attacking against some decks. This is an immediate increase in board presence that it's worth paying 3 mana for in most situations. And, importantly, it helps out 2 other cards in the deck, Dwarven Priest and Loxodon Restorer, both of these at the top of our curve as far as creatures are concerned. It's 2 extra creatures on board for Dwarven Priest, so if we've done nothing but play these 2 cards, we will presumably gain 6 life when we play Priest, which is pretty sweet in and of itself. That'll really help keep us in the game against aggro decks, and Dwarven Priest blocks really well too. 4 toughness is nothing to sneeze at, especially in this format. And then Loxodon Restorer is one of the bigger creatures in their deck. A 3/4 is actually pretty beefy in this format, and often this will only cost us 3 mana and gain us 4 life, which is a really good deal. But we also get to play some really good removal in the deck. We get Pious Interdiction and Moment of Craving. Obviously, Interdiction hasn't seen the play that Moment has in Standard, but this is a great format for it, and it triggers Epicure of Blood, adds to our rapidly growing life total. It's really difficult for other decks to just play the game against us and get us down to 0. So it's good in and of itself, just because of the life gain trigger, but it also takes out pretty much any creature in this format, and it's kind of an Ixalan's Binding, or a Conclave Tribunal type card. So I really, really like it in this deck, and it takes out even the biggest threats in this format. So yes to that, it's worth 4 mana to me, and obviously Moment of Craving as an instant speed way to take out almost any lower curve creature in this entire format and gain us some life at the same time. Yeah, we'll definitely take that. All 4 copies of both of these. As far as the mana base goes, it's fairly simple. We're playing 24, and our dual lands are Forsaken Sanctuary and Evolving Wilds. I don't want to play too many tap lands in the deck because we are trying to get Hawk or Hunted Witness on turn 1. But that said, this is a little slower of a format. It's a little bit more forgiving for the most part when it comes to tap lands. So I do want to play at least these 6 in the deck. But we've also got 10 plains and 8 swamps. 10 plains, mostly because I want to have a fighting chance of getting those 1-drops on turn 1. But we've also got mostly white cards in the deck. But we do need the 8 swamps too, because we're trying to at least cast Epicure and a couple of other black cards, but not really too many. altogether, the deck is fairly solid in this format. It's got a decent curve, it doesn't have slow starts or anything, and it obviously helps itself get into the late game where Epicure of Blood is a really, really good card. This is a fun deck to play. It feels kind of aggro-y, it gets on board fast, and it sustains its life total until it can start doing bigger stuff. We got so much to talk about. Let's go ahead and move on to the next deck that I want to profile. And this is probably the most quote-unquote famous deck on the list because Emma Handy brought it up on Twitter the other day and people have definitely taken note. Let's check out Bant Hexproof. Now, the basic idea behind this deck is to just play all the hexproof creatures. There are a number of hexproof creatures at the common slot in Standard right now, and we're just going to play all of them. We got Soul of the Rapids, Jade Guardian, and Coldwater Snapper in the deck. Now, these all might look like they cost a lot to play, but again, this is a more forgiving format for cards that are higher up on the curve, so these don't feel quite as bad in a format full of commons. And Coldwater Snapper is especially good. A 5 toughness hexproof guy is almost impossible to deal with in this format, and you're actually happy to pay 6 mana for it. Jade Guardian, though, might be one of the best creatures in the entire deck. Other copies of Jade Guardian that you get later in the game usually just add to the first Jade Guardian that you played. It's not uncommon to see 6/6 Jade Guardians, especially after you throw a couple of auras on it. This deck focuses mainly on kind of being like a Bogle's deck from Modern, just with a much, much higher curve. And Soul of the Rapids, I don't want to leave it out either because it's a flying hexproof creature, and that is especially important in this format. All of these are capable of just ending games, especially, again, once you drop a couple of auras on them. It's almost impossible to take care of any of these things, and they just end up winning. Now, as far as those auras that we're playing, we're going to play 4 One with the Wind and 4 Squire's Devotion in the deck. Both of these are just awesome. They give our creatures power bonuses. One with the Wind is especially sweet on a Jade Guardian or Coldwater Snapper. Just a 6 power hexproof flyer is going to win just about every game that you play it in this format. There's not much that can be done about that. And Squire's Devotion is just as good. This gives you an extra dude. For what it's worth, that's not bad, but just a +1/+1 in lifelink to a Jade Guardian or a Coldwater Snapper is a huge game. In the case of the Turtle, a 5 power lifelinker is crazy in and of itself, but when you give it hexproof and you just can't deal with it, there's actually a fair amount of Deece removal in this format that is almost always played in just about every deck. You'll see the same basic removal pieces. And these hexproof creatures just shrug them all off. So things like Squire's Devotion and One with the Wind are exceptionally powerful. But we do have some smaller guys down here on the curve to help supplement our big dudes. We've got 4 Omen Speaker and 4 Llanowar in the deck. Llanowar, especially integral. This is maybe the best common in the format, period, so it shows up an awful lot in Standard Pauper, and it helps us ramp into these bigger guys. Jade Guardian feels a lot better when it effectively costs 3 mana, or at least you can play it on turn 3. Soul of the Rapids on turn 4, Coldwater Snapper, ideally on turn 5. All of those are way, way better, a world of difference from having to wait at least another turn to get them. So Llanowar is an auto-include in the deck. And Omen Speaker, too. This is actually a pretty decent blocker in the early game. At least presents a speed bump to the aggro decks. And more importantly, it helps us scry into our Soul of the Rapids, our Coldwater Snapper, our big hexproof stuff. Or it can help us scry into auras. Sometimes a One with the Wind on an Omen Speaker is not a bad play. Aside from that, we'll clean the deck up with some removal and some card draw here. We've got Luminous Bonds, great removal in this format, Blink of an Eye, which is sort of removal and card draw, and 3 copies of Opt, which is great straight-up card draw, another candidate for best common in the format, maybe. So we'll definitely play a few copies of Opt to, again, help us get to the important cards in our deck, because that's what we're mostly worried about. Blink of an Eye is good tempo. Again, we're just trying to get to big, turn 3, 4, and 5 stuff in this deck. So Blink of an Eye can help set back, again, a speed bump against aggro decks, and it's a good tempo piece, but once we have enough mana, it can also help us draw into big threats and auras. It's a very important card for the deck. And again, Luminous Bonds is actually really, really cheap. It's a decent rate. And it's very easy to cast too, especially when it comes to removal in this format. Luminous Bonds is actually a really good choice for a lot of decks carrying white. Now, this deck is 3 colors, so its mana base is a little bit tougher, but we are playing a bunch of tap lands, 4 Meandering River, 4 Woodland Stream, and 3 Evolving Wilds, because we've really got to get the colors that we want to get in this deck, and for the most part, the first couple of turns of the game aren't really that important to us. I know it sounds crazy, but we can usually afford to cast a Llanowar on turn 2 and play the tap land on turn 1, because it's not like we're trying to ramp into too much, 3 mana turn 2 stuff. So Mono Relves isn't as important as it would normally be for casting early game things, so we don't actually feel too bad about playing these tap lands. That said, tap lands aren't necessarily good, and if there's one weakness to the deck, it's probably all of the tap lands. But that said, we have plenty of all the different sources of mana that we need. But we do have some basics in the deck too, obviously. We've got 4 forests, 3 island, and 2 plains. Mostly we're playing the forest to make sure that we can get to Mono Relves on turn 1 at least some of the time, but again, we don't necessarily have to. Aside from that, we've got some islands because a lot of the deck is actually blue, but we still got room for a couple of plains to make sure that we can get to Luminous Bonds or Squire's Devotion some of the time. Honestly, I think that Ban Hexproof is a candidate for strongest deck in the format. It doesn't really play all the best removal, but it does have some decent removal options. Again, Luminous Bonds is fine to have 4 of, but that's one of the weak points in the deck. But it's not actually that interactive of a deck, really. It's just worried about surviving the early game and getting to its big drops, throwing a One with the Wind on a turtle, and just like winning the game in a couple of swings. So if the deck can get to that point in the game, it can almost always swing things in its favor. But it has to get there, so it can fall to, really hardline aggro decks. There's a mono red aggro deck in this format that's actually really, really fast. So the deck does falter against some things, but for the most part, if the deck can execute its plan, it's almost guaranteed to win the game, and it's one of the strongest decks in the format. Let's move on to a fun one with power, though. This is kind of a ramp deck, but you get to play Dinosaurs. That's right, Selesnya Dinosaurs is open in this format. But as a matter of fact, so is Boros Dinosaurs, Gruul Dinosaurs. There's so much you can do with Dinosaurs at the common level. It's really, really surprising. I think Green-White is the best build because we get all the best ramp. We get Kinjali's Collar in the deck, Mono Relves, and Knight of the Stampede. All of these are super, super sweet ramp options. Honestly, Mono Relves, again, one of the best commons in the format. We're kind of forced to play it in almost any deck that carries green in Pauper, but Kinjali's Collar is sort of a Mono Relves for all intents and purposes when it comes to casting Dinosaurs. And it's a great blocker, too, in the very early game against aggro decks. And Knight of the Stampede can help even the most expensive Dinosaurs cost next to nothing. Now, even though all of these cards help us ramp into bigger stuff like way up on the curve, we've still got some turn 2 and 3 stuff like Raptor Companion and Territorial Hammer Skull. Hammer Skull is a fine creature in its own right, especially at the rate for its mana cost. The stats aren't too bad in a format like Standard Pauper, and it's really good for when you want to go on the offense and get some damage in. Tapping down a creature is actually a fine ability, and Raptor Companion is a surprisingly good 2-drop in this format. It's not necessarily a Danto Vanguard, but the stat line is the same when it's attacking, and it's actually bigger than Danto when it's blocking, so it trades really well with even the best creatures in a lot of aggro decks. This trades up very often, but again, when you need to go on offense against decks that have naked boards, then this can do 6-9 damage before it can be dealt with some of the time. So Companion is actually a really, really aggressive 2-drop, but it can also do some defense for you when you need it to. But let's get to the big stuff. We're playing 4 copies of Colossal Dreadmaw, 4 copies of Sun-Crested Pterodon, more on that in a second, and 2 copies of Ancient Bronzodon. Well, Bronzodon is just huge. He's like the biggest creature available to us in Standard Pauper. And even though he does need Trample, he'll still end the game if he's not taken care of some way or another. He'll eventually just mow through all the chump blockers. And if he even hits once, he threatens to end the game just outright, right then and there. As far as Colossal Dreadmaw, though, this is probably the best of these 3 big dinosaurs. It can do a lot of damage. It can't be chump blocked for what it's worth, and it's relatively cheap. If you get 1 Knight of the Stampede out, then suddenly you don't even have to play a land to play this on your next turn. And by the way, Knight of the Stampede, especially in multiple copies, makes it really, really easy to cast an Ancient Bronzodon too. But in any case, Dreadmaw, again, maybe the best of these dinosaurs and the most easily likely to take over a game when left unchecked. But Sun-Crested Pterodon looks like a weird include. It's actually a really important card. A 5 power flyer in this format, a 5 toughness flyer, is incredibly good on defense. It's going to block just about everything that you need it to block while still being able to attack. It's likely that you'll have another dinosaur out while you have your Pterodon out, so this just gets a free attack in every turn, and it's usually going to end up doing some damage for you. But at the very least, it's going to block pretty much every creature in the air in this format, save for a few. Aside from that, we'll finish things off with 4 Luminous Bonds and 4 Commune with Dinosaurs. Obviously, I've said a lot about Luminous Bonds already, and it applies to this deck too. It's just really good removal, and we need some interaction to keep big threats off the other side of the table. As far as Commune with Dinosaurs goes, though, this is one of the best reasons to play green at all. in a Dinosaurs deck, save for a couple of dinosaurs, obviously. Like, Colossal Dreadmaw is probably the best reason to play green in your Dinosaurs deck in this format. But Community Dinosaurs is the other best reason, It's just a card drawn for 1 mana. It's going to help you fix your mana, get more lands. It drives down the land count for that reason, but it also just helps you find whatever dinosaurs you might need to find at any given time for just the 1 mana. Now, as far as lands go, I'm only playing 4 dual lands here, 4 Selesnya Guildgate, because I really don't want lands to come into play tapped on the first turn. I want either Conchali's Collar or Llanowar Elves, and that requires kind of a lot of basics so that we can make sure we hit those, sequences the way we want to. So we are playing 11 forests to help guarantee Llanowar Elves, and 8 plains to give us a fighting chance of getting Collar on turn 1. Now, overall, if you're going to play Ramp in this format, this is one of your better options. You also get to play Dinosaurs, which is really the big attraction to the deck, is that you get to play Dinosaurs in Pauper, which, that's really, really fun. But at the same time, aside from Mono Green, this is kind of the other ramp deck in the format, and it's really, really good. There are definitely reasons to add white. Again, Raptor Companion is great. Suncrested Pterodon is a lot better than you think it is, and you get some removal in Luminous Bonds, which is maybe one of the best reasons to add white, period. So this is actually a really, really good and relatively versatile ramp deck that gets to play the biggest creatures in the format, which is actually really a great strategy when it comes to Pauper formats. But let's move on so we can look at maybe the most unique deck of these 5, and so therefore kind of my favorite of these 5, and that's Blue-Black Historic. Yeah, we can play Historic in the Pauper format thanks to Artificer's Assistant and, more importantly, Cabal Paladin. These two actually kind of synergize with each other. You want to draw as many artifacts as you can to keep Cabal Paladin going, and Artificer's Assistant allows you to do that. Scry into more artifacts so that next time you draw, you'll get another free 2 damage off of Paladin. But mostly, we're hoping that Cabal Paladin does a good 6 or 8 damage over the course of a game for us, and when we get multiple Cabal Paladins in play, that's when things get really, really dangerous. Once you get your second Paladin, suddenly every artifact you play is hitting for 4, so you only need to play a few artifacts to finish the game. But the only other non-artifact cards in the entire deck are Gearsmith Prodigy and Relic Runner. These are really, really important because they help you add on damage to Cabal Paladin. Just getting 2 damage at a time is not that much. So Cabal Paladin needs a little bit of help to actually get you to 20 damage. And these are both really good early game options to help build up that damage. Gearsmith Prodigy is just a 1 mana 2 power guy, which is good in just about any format, and especially good in a format where the power level is much, much lower overall. So Gearsmith Prodigy is amazing given that you pretty much expect an artifact on turn 2. But when you don't get an artifact on turn 2, you get Relic Runner, which is a great way to set up. Prodigy and a Relic Runner into turn 3 artifact is going to guarantee at least 4 damage, almost guarantee 4 damage, which again is not bad in terms of aggro output in the early game. Prodigy and Relic Runner combine to usually get you a good, reliable, at least 6 damage or more. And Relic Runner, if left unchecked, can get you way more damage than just that. Again, added together with the damage we expect from Cabal Paladin, it's really easy to get to 20. Now, the entire rest of the deck, as far as non-lands go at least, is artifacts here. We've got 22 different artifacts, so more than 1 in 3 of our cards are artifacts for Paladin or Artificer's Assistant, Gearsmith Prodigy, Relic Runner, whatever. We've got a lot of basically artifact payoffs in this deck, but we've got plenty of artifacts to help trigger them. So as far as creatures go, we've got Sparring Construct, Sky Scanner, and Guardians of Koilos. Now, Guardians cost a lot, but it's a way, again, to keep Cabal Paladin going and keep getting these, you played a historic card triggers. Those are really, really important in this deck, obviously. So Guardians puts a fat creature on the board and guarantees another trigger off of our Historic Matters cards. So that's really, really important, even if it costs a good bit of mana. And it's the biggest body in the deck, too, for what it's worth. But Sky Scanner, even though it's a relatively small body, it's still a flying blocker. That's pretty decent some of the time, but it draws us a card. These value creatures are decent in any format, but in this format, they're especially good, and they're even better when you're basically trying to keep, again, these you played a historic card patterns going, these sequences going. So this just provides more fuel to make sure you get more triggers, and that's a really, really important part of the card. But Sparring Construct is just a 1 mana historic trigger, which is the best part of the card, but it's also a body on the battlefield, a way to get started early. A great play line is sometimes just Gearsmith Prodigy into Gearsmith Prodigy plus Sparring Construct on turn 2. That can be a really good way to get on board early, and even when Sparring Construct dies, you get to keep its power on the battlefield, which is really relevant when, say, you put it on a Relic Runner that usually goes unblocked. Also, a little bit of tech here. It's important sometimes to put that +1/+1 counter on a Cabal Paladin to keep it safe from shocks and dead weights and such. But we've got some non-creature artifacts to round things out here. We've got Traveler's Amulet, Prying Blade, and Explosive Apparatus, all as 4s here. Explosive Apparatus is effectively removal, but it's also just extra damage to the face. It's reach. Again, if we're having some trouble crossing the finish line in terms of our damage total, Explosive Apparatus is actually a way to just shock them for a good mana investment, but still, it's a historic trigger in the meantime. We really, really need that. Prying Blade makes our small creatures bigger. Again, making Relic Runner a 3-power guy is actually really, really relevant. And it provides mana, which is important, especially given that it provides black mana, and Cabal Paladin's the only black card in the entire deck. You know, sometimes it's really important to get a treasure just to have that one black source you need to cast a Paladin. So, Prying Blade does all kinds of cool stuff in this deck at just 1 mana. It's a really important card, but so is Traveler's Amulet. This also helps us get the black mana we need for Paladin while driving down the land count at the same time, which is a really, really important thing to be able to do. And again, it's just a 1 mana historic trigger, which is in some ways the best thing about the card. But here's the mana base here, and it's all basic lands. We're actually not playing any duels in this deck. I don't want any lands to come into play tapped because we've got so many turn 1 options. Artificer's Assistant, Gearsmith Prodigy, Sparring Construct, Traveler's Amulet, Prying Blade. There's just so many 1-drops in this deck that I wanted to keep the curve, or I wanted to keep the number of tap lands to an absolute minimum, which it turns out is 0. Altogether, this deck is super, super fun, and I'd really like to play it in Standard and add like Psy at the very least, keep the deck budget, but you could also throw in Karn, and I really think a deck like this would be a lot of fun. You might not even end up playing Cabal Paladin in the end in a deck like that, but for Standard Pauper, Cabal Paladin is a really, really fun deck, and it's not even the only important card in the deck. Obviously, Artificer's Assistant, Gearsmith Prodigy, Relic Runner, these are great ways to both fix your draws in the case of Artificer's Assistant, but also get a little aggressive in the early game and almost guarantee some damage on top of all the damage you're doing with Paladins. So give this deck a try. If you like a sort of combo-y deck that still gets to play creatures, this is the deck for you. It's a fun one. But let's finish things off here with Blue-Red Urchin, or Blue-Red Cyclops, one or the other. Basically, this is a Blue-Red Spells deck, but for Standard Pauper. We're playing 4 copies of Fire Urchin, 4 copies of Piston Fist Cyclops, 4 Getsu Lava Runner, and 3 Wee Dragonauts. So we actually get a fair amount of creatures in this deck. 15 in all, which is about where a Spells deck wants to be, but all of these really, really benefit a Spells plan. Obviously, Fire Urchin is a great blocker in the early game in this format, and has a form of prowess that'll really help when you start casting a bunch of spells. Piston Fist Cyclops, it is very, very easy to attack with this, and the rate in this format is really, really good for 3 mana, and you're going to be making an attack nearly every turn anyway. And Getsu Lava Runner, don't even have to tell you, in a deck full of spells, this is just a 1 mana, 2-power creature. Already established, that's fine in any format, but it's especially good here, and the haste is great too. So yes to that, but there's also, if that weren't enough, Wee Dragonauts, which is sort of our Enigma Drake in this deck. We don't really, I wish we had the option to do that, but Wee Dragonauts is a great replacement. And again, on turns where you play, 2-3 spells, Wee Dragonauts will be a huge guy. Now, to back up our creatures, we've mostly got just a bunch of really, really cheap spells, mostly that draws cards. We've got Opt, Crash Through, and Warlord's Fury in this deck to just keep drawing cards. And Crash Through and Warlord's Fury will benefit once we actually get to our attack step some of the time. So that's important, but mostly we just want the cheapest cantrips imaginable. So we're going to play all of these 1 mana ways to draw cards. But we've also got Tormenting Voice and Radical Idea in there. Tormenting Voice is great, draws you a bunch of cards and lets you dump mostly jumpstart stuff into your graveyard, like, Tormenting Voice, dump a Radical Idea, fine play, and Radical Idea in your graveyard guarantees that you get an attack step in with Piston Fist, or, a bigger Wee Dragonauts when you go in, or a bigger Fire Urchin, whatever. So it's really important to have these jumpstart cards. So important that I'm also playing a Maximize Velocity and 3 Maximize Altitude. Maximize Altitude is so good with Piston Fist, or Fire Urchin, or even Wee Dragonauts. Just having any of these sitting in your graveyard, available to play for just 1 mana and activate all of your spells matter guys, is really, really important. Jumpstart cards are so good in this deck, and having them available for just the 1 mana is really good, much less ones that make your Getsu Lava Runner or your Piston Fist fly. That is just really, really good. So at least a few copies of both of these cards. Just the 1 Velocity, I definitely think it's the worst of these 2 cards, but it's still fine. But I'm at least playing the 3 Maximize Altitude, because this card is actually a lot better than it looks. Now, as far as the mana base, we're playing 20 lands, and there are, again, no duels because I don't want anything to come into play tapped on turn one. I want the option of Shock or Opt, Crash Through, Warlord Furies, all of those things are good to play on turn one. And yeah, Crash Through and Warlord's Fury, even if you don't have creatures. Sometimes you'll want to play them on turn one just to kind of cycle them in a way. So I want the option to do it. I'm not going to play any duels in the deck. You could if you wanted to, but I'm mostly focusing on getting important stuff on turn one. Now, altogether, if you're a Drake's player and you want to play something similar in Standard Pauper, this is probably your best bet. It's a fun deck. Spells decks are always great, and Wizards have made sure that Standard Pauper actually has a workable blue-red spells deck that we can play. And this deck is actually a lot of fun. You're just throwing spells everywhere. Everything costing you just a couple of mana. You get to play very, very few lands, and even on turns where you don't necessarily draw gas, you've still got a bunch of jumpstart cards in your graveyard to benefit you. So this deck is really fun, and it never truly runs out of gas. And there you have it. 5 different Standard Pauper decks, and I tried to give you the most unique decks that I could figure out here. There's surprising depth to this format. I've already mentioned that a couple of times, but it's true. I could have done 10 unique Standard Pauper decks because Wizards has actually provided us with a really, really deep format, like way deeper than you would assume. There's other cool decks here. There's a green-white tokens deck. That much is pretty obvious, but there's also like Rat Colony and a couple of other cool things you can do in this format. I've already mentioned like a mono-red deck, but there's also a mono-red aggro deck that's basically a Goblins deck. It plays like Skirk Prospector, and it tries to make its way up to the dragon that has Kicker, like Spark Tongue Dragon. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in this format that we could research like all day, but these are just my 5 favorites. Let me know in the comments, what your favorite Standard Pauper decks are, because I know everyone's having so much fun with this event right now. And I really want Standard Pauper to have some actual support because Wizards has, again, given us a format where it looks like it could actually be supported. Again, there's real depth here. So, hope you guys enjoy the format and the video for that matter. If you did, remember, like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. Sorry for the plug, but I got to do it. It's part of my job. If you want to, hit me down there in the in the description box. I've got links to not only every single one of these decks on TCG Player, but also my Patreon page. If you really want to help out the channel, be part of our growth, then it just takes $1 a month, and it helps out more than you can possibly imagine. So if you're into it, check the link down there. If not, that's cool. I just appreciate you being here. I've been Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.